Okay, everyone, I think it's about time for us to get started. Welcome to the July program of Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium. The Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium is our tight-knit history community's venue to catch up and enjoy speakers talking about our community. Based on the initial responses to the evaluations from the last session, we can concretely prove y'all missed the in-person symposium magic at East Library. And I admit Zoom is the same as meeting all day. But we'd like to make a quick announcement. On September 25th, we will be hosting a mini symposium social in person at East Library. That mini event will be from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. We're still working out the final details, but we intend to try to recreate some of that symposium magic, especially that social element that we've all been craving. There will be an email that goes out about this once we start to finalize those details. In the meantime, I'd like to resume the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium as we commemorate the sesquicentennial of the founding of Colorado Springs. This is the third of 4 sessions over the summer, and I know you'll enjoy the great slate of speakers we have scheduled for today. And if you can't make all of the virtual programs throughout the summer, remember we're recording these and posting them on PPLD's YouTube channel. Logistically, we will have 3 20-minute long presentations today. At the end of all 3 presentations, we will moderate a short Q&A with the presenters. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions for the speakers. We hope you all also use the chat as a discussion board, not with the speakers, but with one another. That's one of the perks of virtual programming, is that you can talk during the presentations. Now, I'd like to introduce the Library District's CEO and Chief Librarian, John Spears.
Thank you, Brett, and welcome to Pikes Peak Library District and our 3rd installment of this summer's Regional History Symposium. Pikes Peak Library District is a nationally recognized system of public libraries that serves El Paso County, Colorado. With 15 facilities, online resources, and mobile library service, we strive to creatively respond to the unique needs of individual neighborhoods and the community at large. Our mission calls us to bring positive change to individual lives and to help build our community. One of the ways we do that is through events such as this, events that help us understand who we are through an exploration of our history. But history can do so much more than just tell the stories of the past. History is essential for developing our community's engaged citizen. Democracy thrives when individuals convene to express their opinions, to listen to others, and to take action. Weaving history into these discussions about contemporary issues can clarify the differing perspectives and misperceptions, reveal complexities, ground competing views and evidence, and introduce new ideas. All of that can lead to greater understanding and hopefully the attainment of viable solutions to the problems that communities face. Based on this perspective, the History Symposium can inspire leadership at every level throughout our community, and that's what this is about. History builds community. As part of the community, this event is a product of the efforts of many who I wish to recognize. I want to thank our sponsors, Helen and James McCaffrey Fund for Regional History, the Friends of the Pikes Peak Library District, and the Pikes Peak Library District Foundation. Our partners, Pikes Peak Community College, Pikes Peak Genealogical Society, Pikes Peak Posse of the Westerners, the Western Museum of Mining and Industry, and the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And then finally, and most importantly, the PPLD staff. This wouldn't be possible without the work of many departments across our entire district. Communications, the entire regional history and genealogy team, especially Chris Nickel, who was instrumental in the creation and development of the Pikes Peak Regional History Symposium. Chris retired this year after 20 years of dedicated service to the community. We wish to give her our most gracious thanks for her hard work throughout her many years with PPLD. And now it's my real honor to introduce a woman that I have heard speak several times over the past months. And every time I have heard her speak, I have learned so much. And not only that, but I've been in awe of her ability to just speak extemporaneously off the cuff about so many major issues and historical facts in the Pikes Peak region. So I'd like to introduce Leah Davis Witherow, the curator of history for the Colorado Springs Pioneer Museum. Leah graduated with a BA in history and a certificate in Eastern European and Russian studies from California State University, Long Beach, and a Master of Arts in History from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Additionally, she's taught history at UCCS since 2000, specializing in the history of Colorado, the Progressive Era, labor, and women. In 2014, she was selected as the UCCS College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences Outstanding Lecturer of the Year, and in 2018 was selected as a Women of Influence by the Colorado Springs Business Journal. Leah is a previous Regional History Symposium presenter and author, and so now, Leah Davis Witherow to present a story that must be told, trailblazing entrepreneur, Mama Susie Perkins.
Thank you so much, John, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Pikes Peak Library District for continuing to examine and share our important regional history. The Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum is always so proud and honored to work with you in all capacities. So in thinking about the sesquicentennial and the COS at 150 exhibit that I was working on throughout 2020 and opened on January 30th of this year, the goal was to really broaden our understanding of what is regional history, to be much more inclusive, to look more deeply, to be more reflective of the rich, complex history in our region. And I became very interested in the life and legacy of Mama Susie Perkins and realized what a perfect fit she was to the PPLD Symposium's topic this year, but also for inclusion in two important exhibits at the CSPM, the Una Familia Grande, the Conejos Neighborhood Project, and also COS at 150. So Mama Susie Perkins is truly someone I believe we all should know. We all have heard numerous stories of Fannie Mae Duncan and the Cotton Club, as well we should. But my argument today is we should also all know the story of Mama Susie Perkins. Next slide, Kara. At the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, we're always interested in using local individuals, events, places to understand larger narratives, larger phenomenon that are occurring across our country and the world, to connect people in the Pikes Peak region to things that historical processes that are happening outside and inside of Colorado. And Mama Susie Perkins and Fannie Mae Duncan, for that matter, help us understand what's known as the Great Migration. 6 million African Americans moving out of the South seeking social, economic, and political opportunity. The first phase of this was the Civil War, post-Civil War, 1865 to 1914 to 16, World War I. The second phase, which was the largest, 1916 to 1930, and then the other shoulder season, 1930 into the 40s and 50s. Mama Susie Perkins highlights what that looked like for an individual family to move out of the South, fleeing Jim Crow terrorism, segregation, and violence, and moving north and west to cities looking for, next slide please, Kara, social, political, and economic opportunity. And in several exhibits at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, we actually look at this process. The gallery on the third floor, called Any Place North and West, examines this story in great detail. What was it like for Black families moving out of the South, moving to Colorado Springs, looking for opportunity, fleeing segregation and Jim Crow discrimination by law, to a community and facing challenges in that new community that reflected de facto discrimination. Next slide, Kara. De facto versus de jure discrimination. So de jure is of and by the law. Those are the Black codes that were implemented post-Civil War. That's the Jim Crow era South, where Blacks were discriminated in law, in the legal process. De facto discrimination, as practiced in other cities in the North and in the West, looked different. It meant that although there were no laws in place discriminated against where Blacks could live, work, play, go to school, in practice, there was a great deal of discrimination. We know through oral histories in our collections and in the fabulous special collections of Pikes Peak Library District that Black families moving west to places like Denver and Colorado Springs, the de facto or by practice discrimination they found was disconcerting. It was confusing. Some even go as far to say, in the South, we knew the rules, that we didn't respect them and they were oppressive, but there was a set of rules that everyone understood. The type of discrimination Black families found in Colorado Springs, in the Pikes Peak region, and Colorado writ large, was a whisper campaign. It was, how do you know where to live or where to work, to where to eat, and how to gain employment unless you talk to someone. There were no set written rules. You had to find that out through experience, as we'll see in the next slide. In Colorado Springs, as in all of Colorado, schools were not segregated. So we had integrated education from the very outset. This was enormously important to Black families moving north and west who wanted their children to have every possible educational opportunity. And indeed, they did have that in Colorado Springs. But as a result, that meant that Black educators moving here from other communities could not get jobs in our education system because white families did not want their children taught by Black teachers. In fact, the Colorado Springs Unity Council was largely responsible for advocating for Black teachers, Black nurses in the 1950s, and Colorado Springs had its first Black elementary school teacher, Nina Stroud Pellerin, in 1954. Coincidentally or not, that is the same year that Brown versus Board of Education passed. So while there were expanded opportunities for children, that meant limited employment for Black adults. Next slide, please. It also created discrepancies and disparities, inequities as to where Black families could live. So there are some covenants in certain neighborhoods in Colorado Springs that preclude Black residents from moving in. They're still technically written in deeds today, but there were no official city or county codes limiting where African-American families could move. But we know, and we've researched, we use census data and city directories to plot African-American families in 1905. And while this map will change over time, the red star is the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, so you can sort of locate yourself on this map. We know that these neighborhoods expanded greatly as Colorado Springs grew, but we see a clustering effect, and that clustering effect is a result of de facto discrimination. When Alice Morgan married Reverend Justice Morgan in 1954, they sought to buy a house. And as they traveled around Colorado Springs visiting different neighborhoods, their real estate agent told them point blank, this is not a neighborhood you can move into. So she and Reverend Justice Morgan ended up moving into the near west side off of Walnut Street, a historically Black working class neighborhood, right near their family. They had hoped to buy a new house further out east, but they weren't able to because of de facto discrimination. Next slide, please. Now, Mama Susie Perkins is going to be a solution to this problem. She moves to Colorado Springs in 1937 with her mother, Lila Harrison. Her mother had asthma and suffered from some heart trouble. So just like so many thousands of others, they moved to Colorado Springs in search of better health. And in fact, Mrs. Harrison lived another 30 years quite healthfully. But Susie Perkins was born in 1902 in Winona, Mississippi, the granddaughter of sharecroppers. And she saw firsthand her grandmother broken into tears when they were forced to leave the property that they were sharecroppers on because they weren't returning enough money, enough value to the property owner. So they lost their home and the land that they had worked for decades. This signaled something in a young Susie Perkins. She realized that she wanted to, one, make her own money. She wanted to buy her own home, not rely on anyone else, certainly not a landlord. But she also, this spurred something in her to purchase homes and enter the real estate market herself. So she and her mother arrived with Susie Perkins' son, Thomas Wright, in 1937. She worked as a practical care nurse, she worked in restaurants, and then she bought a trash hauling truck. Because of de facto discrimination in Colorado Springs, so many Black adults, Black workers were entrepreneurs. They owned boot black shops, they owned barber shops, they owned trash hauling businesses where they could be their own boss, their own employer, and hire other Black workers. So Mama Susie Perkins buys a trash hauling truck and she begins driving this truck 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And she notices rundown vacant homes in Colorado Springs. And she begins to purchase them and renovate them, or we would say today, flip them with the assistance of family members, and then begins to rent them out all around Colorado Springs, but in these historically Black neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Camp Carson coming in, the Congress deciding to place a camp here in January of 1942, work actually began. Local Chamber of Commerce and civic leaders began advocating for a cantonment here as early as the summer of 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor being bombed. But in January 42, the decision was made to place a camp here. 11,000 civilian workers were brought in to build a camp that could serve 30,000 soldiers, and that camp was built in 6 months. It's an audacious, ambitious plan. They needed a lot of workers to make it happen. Many of those workers were Hispanos from Southern Colorado, Blacks from other parts of Colorado and the South and Midwest were drawn here for an opportunity to work and make a good living. But this resulted in a housing crisis. Next slide, please. So this is a map drawn from memory by Josie Ontiveros, one of the really kind of the heart of our Una Familia Grande neighborhood project, our exhibit at the CSPM. She helped kind of build this exhibit and conceptualize it, donated her materials, her stories, and encouraged many other families to also get involved in the project. She grew up in the Conejos neighborhood, which of course no longer exists today. Today, America the Beautiful Park sits atop of it. This is a neighborhood that has been erased from the physical landscape, but not the memories of anyone who ever lived there. Conejos was a fluid place, a transitional neighborhood where Hispanos from Southern Colorado, Black families, Jewish families, Eastern European families moved into this neighborhood as sort of their first step into Colorado Springs. The people that lived in Conejos kept the railroad running. They built Camp Carson, later Fort Carson. They built all those homes out east. They are responsible for building the growth that Colorado Springs achieved as a result of Camp Carson. Fort Carson is probably next to our founding, the single most significant event in our history in terms of really being a catalyst for growth in the future development of Colorado Springs. So workers flooded into our community, but they didn't have places to live because of a lack of housing and also de facto discrimination. So Conejos was always a place that welcomed newcomers, a multiracial neighborhood. The green arrow points to the Perkins family home. They lived in Conejos for decades. And then right next to it is apartment building, Perkins apartment building. Mama Susie Perkins began to establish an entire set of properties. They grew every single year. She continued to drive trash hauling trucks 6 days a week for 12 years. The goal was she would never have to work again, but the truth is she kept on working. The woman was ambitious, she had vision, she had drive, and she had energy. And her goal was to provide homes to other families. Next slide, please. She married William Bill Perkins in 1947. He is pictured on the far right of this photograph, and he, along with other family members, she's the capital, she's the vision, she's the brains. They would help renovate or flip these homes and then rent them out to families. Next slide, please. He was a partner in her business. She also was a tireless advocate for more affordable housing. Again, just as John said a few moments earlier, we don't study the past just to study the past or memorize a set of facts. We study the past to help us understand the present and possibly consider a more equitable or better future. What do we want in the future? How do we be a better community, a more inclusive and equitable community? Mama Susie Perkins is going to the planning department and going to regional building and going to city council again and again and again, asking for what she called housing for her people. There was a housing crisis in Colorado Springs so dire that civil rights activists and NAACP local leader Charles Banks, who really led a series of sit-ins and lawsuits against businesses that were discriminated against Blacks and other minorities in Colorado Springs, he wrote a letter of protest to U.S. Colorado Senator Big Ed Johnson, calling out the lack of housing, the lack of ability for families, Black Fort Carson soldiers, and the workers necessary to keep the economy of Colorado Springs going, was so dire that Mama Susie Perkins was trying to figure out how to increase the amount of affordable housing in Colorado Springs, and so were others. Next slide, please. This is an example of something I found in the city directories. She had an ad in the Gazette every single day for 50 years running. She also advertised in the NAACP flyers and programs. She advertised in the Urban League. She advertised in a whole host of local programs and brochures. But this is her ad in the city directories in 1953. Susie Perkins Apartments, furnished rooms and apartments at reasonable rates. All races and children are welcome. Get acquainted with Mama Susie. She met a need in Colorado Springs because she rented to folks that other landlords discriminated against. Black Fort Carson soldiers and their families, mixed race couples, and single mothers who were turned away by other landlords. Next slide, please. She also was a woman of inimitable style. She was known to drive around Colorado Springs in her brand new Lincoln Continentals. She wore ball gowns and tiaras. She was a woman who made a big impact. And the folks in the Conejos neighborhood that we've interviewed and other oral histories that we've done, she was a larger than life character with an enormous present. She absolutely fits the topic of this year's symposium, nice, naughty, and notable. I would argue that she's nice and notable. Next slide, please. And that photograph, by the way, was in front of their home in the Conejos neighborhood. She was also an astute businesswoman. When she received the Negro Historical Association of Colorado Springs Businesswoman of the Year Award in 1983, she made some remarks. And those remarks are, she encouraged young people to save their money, to not owe money to banks, to doctors, to lawyers, to own property, and to be generous and to be kind. She was known to be quite the philanthropist. She adopted Washington Elementary School on the west side, one of the poorest schools in Colorado Springs, and acted as a secret Santa. She furnished lunches to children who came to school hungry. She made sure their lunches were paid. She made sure children had school supplies and presents at Christmas time. She did this all quietly. She didn't seek notoriety or fame or recognition. She did it because she believed that you should care for others in your community. Next slide, please. In 1977, she was awarded the Western States Baptist Convention Woman of the Year. She was a woman of deep faith. She belonged to St. John's Baptist Church in Colorado Springs for over 5 decades. She was a deaconess. She sang in the church choir. She also was interested in politics. In 1984, when Jesse Jackson was running for president, she furnished the Colorado Springs for Jesse Jackson campaign free rooms on Pueblo Avenue as one of the many buildings she owned along Pueblo Avenue, which was really the heart of Black life and culture in Colorado Springs for decades. Next slide, please. This is a quote from a 1983 Gazette interview where she shares a little of detail about how generous she was. That year, she went $15,000 in the red because of many of her residents were out of work. And in addition to not having to pay rent, she actually paid their utilities. She paid their bills. Mama Susie Perkins was a landlord that you could come to and share your situation, and she would spot you rent or even help provide you with groceries, because she says here, I want to help people. Since I own all my own rentals, the most I have to do is pay the utilities and keep my babies warm. They're all my babies, every one of them. She passed away at the age of 98, 2 years shy of her 100th birthday in December of 2000. She left behind her son, Thomas Wright, and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. But more than that, she leaves a legacy of tackling a problem, tackling a major social issue, trying to create more equity in our community, doing right by her neighbors. And I think she is someone that we need to know her story, to know it well, to use as an example when we are going through tough times, as arguably we've all been through so much history in the past year. Mama Susie Perkins and other Black women entrepreneurs like her can provide us an example of how to do the right thing in difficult times. Thank you so much. Thank you to Pikes Peak Library District for this opportunity, and I look forward to any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Leah. That was enlightening. I will speak for myself and say that I haven't I don't know very much about Mama Susie Perkins, so that really sort of fleshed out a lot. I can't wait till we get to the Q&A session at the very end, so we can hopefully have a little bit more of a discussion. At which point I will stress that if you do have questions, please use that Q&A function on the bottom ribbon, and you can put those in for any of our presenters, Leah, Eric, or Greg. In which case, I think it is time to introduce Eric Metzger. He grew up in Littleton, Colorado, and spent much of his life along the Front Range, preserving and interpreting cultural resources in both nonprofit and for-profit organizations. He holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology from University of Colorado at Boulder and a master's degree in museum administration from Harvard University. Before joining the McAllister House Museum as executive director, Eric was director of education and museum services at the Metropolitan Waterworks Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. Eric is a previous Regional History Symposium speaker, and he will be speaking today about the McAllister House and its place in 150 years of Colorado Springs history. Eric?
Thank you, Brett. And thank you to the PPLD for this fantastic symposium. And I'd also like to thank Leah for that nice presentation. When I was thinking about what to present to a very important time in Colorado Springs history, our 150th anniversary, I thought about the McAllister House Museum, and I thought about how it persists through time. The McAllister House has been around for quite some time, and it's been important in a number of different ways. And so I'd like to point out the different ways in which the McAllister House has been significant throughout 150 years of Colorado Springs history. Next slide, please, Kara. So I've entitled it The McAllister House and Its Place in 150 Years of Colorado Springs History. Thank you, Karen. In order to start out, I'd like to make sure that everybody understands Major McAllister's role in the development and particularly the early years in the history of Colorado Springs. When McAllister arrives for the first time in Colorado Springs in April of 1872, he is already the director of the Union Contract Company that built the Denver and Rio Grande line from Denver to Pueblo. He is also on the board of directors of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, and he is the president of the National Land and Improvement Company. So again, let me emphasize that those are roles that McAllister had undertaken when living in Philadelphia before he moved out to Colorado Springs. In addition to those roles, those Colorado Springs-oriented roles, he still was working as the secretary of the American Association of Iron and Steel in Philadelphia. And when he first visits, and then after a few weeks leaves to go back to Philadelphia, he will ponder taking the position as the executive director of the Fountain Colony. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, McAllister leaves after spending a couple weeks in April in Colorado Springs, and then he returns on April 1st, 1872, as the executive director of the Fountain Colony. He won't spend too much time out here. At that point, he'll be here for a couple months in 1872, and then he will leave to go back to Philadelphia to, as this article in Out West says, in November, to fetch his family. The reason for the timing of McAllister's coming and going in 1872 is because he has recently started a family in Philadelphia, and he has had his firstborn son, Harry, in 1872. So he's trying to juggle the development of his family. He wants to be there for the birth of his son, but he also wants to assume the duties out here in Colorado Springs. We've got some interesting quotes from the Out West, and later on we'll look at some Gazette articles, and they're talking about both the need for a leader out here in Colorado Springs, but they're also kind of looking forward to the future when he will return and what he has meant so far to the city of Colorado Springs. There's also something interesting in this particular article, and that says he hopes to take with him some specimens of our vegetable productions. While that might seem like a pretty innocuous comment there, it's actually important to his role. Later on, we'll talk about the experimental garden on the McAllister House grounds and its role in the diversification of the economy here in Colorado Springs. Down at the bottom here, we've got a prescient comment that speaks to his abilities and is speaking about, since he has taken the reins of government, colony matters have been exceedingly prosperous, and we shall be glad to see him back amongst us. His significance in the early year that he assumes responsibilities can be seen in this articles in the Out West. Thank you, Karen. So in the Gazette articles, we see, and these kind of emphasize the importance of McAllister's arrival. They printed his resignation letter from the American Association of Iron and Steel so that people could kind of track what his responsibilities were going to be and when he was going to be able to assume them fully. They talk about the major pulling up stakes back in Philadelphia. They're glad to see him back again, settling his affairs back there. But it's also interesting to note that even though McAllister has not come back during this time period, and that is October and February of 1872, that he is doing a lot in Philadelphia and in Midwestern cities between Colorado Springs and Philadelphia to recruit people out here to Fountain Colony. He's bringing produce with him, he's speaking in cities, and he's doing the best he can as the person that is most responsible for the development of Colorado Springs and its economy. He's doing the best he can to get people out, selling them land, and bringing them skills with them that will be applicable to the economy here in Colorado Springs. So this last point that he's lecturing for the benefit of the colony, McAllister must have been a very hard worker because he is doing a lot already at that point, trying to get people out to Colorado Springs and bringing skills that would be pertinent to the economy here. Next slide, please, Karen. So I don't expect everybody to read every one of these, but I just wanted to give you an impression of all the different roles and responsibilities that Major McAllister undertook here in Colorado Springs, but also up at the top there in Philadelphia for the colony before he even arrives. So notice that he's president of the National Land and Improvement Company, a board member of the Rio Grande, and director of the North-South Construction Company, and director of the Union Contract Company. These are companies that were set up in great part to construct the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. So he's been a partner with Palmer for years before he even comes out. A couple other things that I'd like to note down at the bottom: a delegate for the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati in 1876, and Executive Committee, Colorado Women's Suffrage Association in 1877. So his impact and his responsibility here in the Fountain Colony was broad, and he took on those responsibilities with gusto. Next slide, please. So shifting gears a little bit to the house and grounds itself. We don't have a whole lot of very many pictures of the house and grounds. This is one of my favorite pictures, though, not because it shows the McAllister House in the background there, very hard to see, but you can see the bay window and the south side of the house in the back, but because of it's showing the neighborhood. And if we were going on a walk up Cascade circa 1875, we would see these trees, which McAllister helped to get planted on the main streets, but we would not see a whole lot of vegetation or horticulture or gardening in these lots like we're looking at. And this is the Paber Cottage right in front of us on Bijou and Cascade. You can see that they've plowed the back and that they've got a garden coming up, but pretty practical, not a lot of horticulture or fanciful gardening going on in Colorado Springs at this time. And we can see that in the houses as we look back a little bit further. As we approach the McAllister House on this walk up north, we would see something vastly different. Next slide, please. So instead of building a Victorian house in a vernacular style or something that resembles some of the folk Victorian styles, the McAllisters chose to build something that was a little different. And what it really is a rural English farmhouse. That's the style at which this design was created. And what they did is they bought a very large lot, almost an acre in size, not because they knew that they would expand the size of the house, but because they were going to plant an experimental garden on the grounds. That extra acreage is going to be used for gardening with this experimental garden, apple orchards, strawberries, grapes, a number of things. And at the time that they build that, they are on the outskirts of town, as we can see there in this famous photograph on the right. Next slide, please. And of course, the Gazette is tracking the building of the executive director's home. And this is kind of interesting to see the emphasis that they have on the structure itself as it goes up, noting that the foundation has gone in, the walls have gone up, that the last final touches have been made on the most handsome residence in town. But also take a look at this highlighted article on the left there. And we begin to see the McAllister House being used for leverage in different ways, not just regarding the economy, as the major will use it later on, but also in politics. And this particular article points out that some people that are running for office are saying that the Colorado Springs Company may not exist. Remember that we've got a nationwide and international economic crisis going on in 1873 that persists all the way to 1879. And that is having an effect on land sales in Colorado Springs. And so in this article, they're saying, well, you might not want to buy land here, or you might think about voting for us because the Colorado Springs Company may not exist much longer. However, the existence of the McAllister House and its going up, its structure, its sense of permanence should show you that the Colorado Springs Company is here to stay. So it's being used for marketing, as advertisements. It's already getting complex in 1873, the reasons for the building of the McAllister House, other than the personal reasons that the Major and Mrs. McAllister might have. Next slide, please. So what do we know about the house itself from the historic record? We know that George Summers, who was kind of the city architect of the early years, was the architect of the McAllister House, but put a little asterisk there because I'm going to comment on that in just a moment. Summers was a professional architect. He practiced in Philadelphia, and he was an AIA registered architect in 1870 in Philadelphia. Many of you know that Winfield Scott Stratton was the carpenter on the house and Lewis Whipple was the builder. But the main question that you see highlighted at the bottom there is, was the original design by Summers? Did Summers sit down and sketch out that design and show it to the McAllisters? And so the answer to that question is no. Next slide, please. The design of the McAllister House is by a man named Andrew Jackson Downing. And we could have a whole conversation about Andrew Jackson Downing, fascinating person. But what's key to look at is the date of his life there. So he is a landscape architect, the son of an horticulturalist living in Newburgh, New York, which is on the Hudson River. And his life is from 1815 to 1852. He dies young on a steamboat accident on the Hudson River, where he's last seen helping women and children get off the boat. And that, of course, ends his career. I dare say we would know more about Andrew Jackson Downing had he survived that accident. He is America's first landscape architect, and he designs what we know of now as the McAllister House. Next slide, please. That design occurs in this book, which is published in 1850. So again, I'm going to emphasize that date, 1850. The date of the McAllister House being built is 1873. So the design shows up in this Andrew Jackson Downing book in 1850, and it's called The Architecture of Country Homes. I love these long titles that these authors used to give the books back in those days, but it's important for us to look at this title if we're not going to browse through the book, because this is a comprehensive book about how to build and what you might furnish and ventilate a house if you don't understand those concepts. So I'm just going to read that, including designs for cottages, farmhouses, and villas, with remarks on interiors, furniture, and the best modes for warming and ventilating. And then, of course, that date of 1850. Very important that the McAllister stumbled across this design. They were probably familiar with this book, even though it was an 1850 publication. Next slide, please. So here we are. This is design number 17 in the book, and it is entitled By Downing, a Farmhouse in the English Rural Style, and that is the McAllister House. If you come on a tour to the McAllister House, we start our tours for the most part at that angle on the property. The design was not meant to be viewed from the front perpendicularly, but meant to be viewed in its best light from the side there. And that's where we start our tours. You can see what Downing was intending by this design. And again, an English rural farmhouse. And to such of our readers who are looking for an expression of more beauty in a farmhouse, we present this design. Unmistakable look of having been born and bred in the country. Planned not for elegance, but for utility. So this is very interesting to study what Downing intended by this design, and then to look at who the McAllisters are, and to see if this aligns with who they're talking about, or people are talking about the McAllisters, who they are, and seeing if these cultures match up. And certainly in my experience, they do seem to match up incredibly well. So that is the home, and the design is from Andrew Jackson Downing, and number 17 in his book. Next slide, please. Changing gears a little bit to the horticulture. This volume by Paber, which was published in 1883, is very important for our understanding of this experimental garden on the McAllister House grounds. Before the house was even finished, in very early 1874, probably January, the McAllisters were already working on their experimental garden on the grounds. The emphasis of that garden, the most labor, the most productivity, is going to be in the apple varieties that are planted on those grounds. The major was interested not in providing fruit for himself and for his family, although he certainly did want those things. That was not the intent of this garden. The intent was to diversify the economy of Colorado Springs in the agricultural realms. He had an apple orchard, a grape vineyard, and strawberry plants, many types of vegetables, as well as your basic horticulture, flowers, shrubs, and trees. And we have this book in our gift shop at the McAllister House. If anybody's interested, they could stop by and take a look. But that's a neat piece of literature that helps us understand Major McAllisters. Mostly the detail in the book is from State Horticultural Society and then Pomological Society meetings and papers that were delivered both locally and at the state level. Next slide, please. So I've just put up this little grid to show people the size of the McAllister House grounds originally. They purchased 8 of these 25-foot wide lots. So we go across 190 feet back to the alleyway. They originally purchased 8 of those, and they had the whole second back half of that block. Later on, they sell that as they begin to get a little bit older, and they just garden on the second, so 5 through 8 on that grid. It was 0.87 acres originally, so it was a good sized lot. And again, I want to emphasize their reason for buying that large lot was for horticultural purposes, not so that they could expand their house or build a new house later on that large lot. It was always the intent was for horticulture on that property. Next slide, please. So this is just a very admittedly rudimentary map that I have created. This is my interpretation of what the grounds may have looked like. So the top of the screen would be Cascade. On the right of the screen, that would be St. Vrain. And on the bottom of the screen, that would be the alleyway. and you can see the house. We can see this interesting thing that the McAllisters put up a hedgerow across the front of the house to block the wind. The wind was a problem back then, and it certainly is now. And so they just solved that by putting a wind block right up there. They weren't that concerned that it blocked people's view of this lovely new house in Colorado Springs. That hedgerow went up right away in 1874. I show the irrigation lines coming in, and then most likely you had orchard on the south and north sides. We know that McAllister grew a lot of different varieties, and so I've kind of done some math and spacing and come up with some calculations as to how much of the property was under the apple orchard, under the plow with the apples. We've got Concord grapes growing, and then a very large vegetable garden, and they kept track of the dates that things were planted, the dates of harvest, frosts, early frosts, late frosts, all these different things. They did this in a scientific manner so that the major could use the data from this experimental garden, and he could lecture on it and deliver papers all over the state of Colorado. Next slide, please. After 10 years of experimentation, McAllister recommends the following apple varieties for southern Colorado. We have recently replanted some apple trees on the grounds, and we have chosen 2 of the available legacy varieties that are still available today, the Duchess of Oldenburg and the Red Astrachan. We've recently planted those and dedicated those to the city of Colorado Springs on our 150th anniversary. There are some of the other recommendations that he makes. Again, this is from the paper publication in 1883. So he's going on 10, 11 years of experimenting with different types of apples that are going to grow in our environment here on the high plains of Colorado Springs. Next slide, please. So we're taking a jump in time here, but I want to review the different sorts of things that have happened on the McAllister House grounds and in the McAllister House. When the major dies in 1921, he leaves the house to first Harry, but then Harry had been directed previously to leave the house to his 2 sisters, Mary and Matilda. And Matilda rents out the McAllister House starting in 1923 to Fanny Robbins, and she has a gift shop and a candy factory in the McAllister House. She lasts there for decades, a long time, and apparently had a successful business. This is a piece of note card here on the left that has her logo. She uses a little robin. And then we've got this fantastic picture that is circa 1927 here on the right. And that melodeon, that instrument sitting right there that's being used as a table, is the melodeon that is in the McAllister House that came from George Summers as a gift to the McAllisters early on. I have not been able to understand if this is Fanny Robbins herself that is in the bay window here, but a fantastic picture early on of this woman who made a great business in the McAllister House for decades. Next slide, please. Jumping ahead to 1961, this is this fantastic picture we have of opening day of the McAllister House Museum. In the front here, in this picture on the left, that is T. Sherman McAllister. That's Mr. and Mrs. McAllister's grandson. And in this fanciful hat is Matilda, the youngest daughter of Major and Mrs. McAllister. And then in the middle there, right about to cut the ribbon, is Charles Tutt. We were very happy to have him there that day. And El Pomar did a lot to get that museum open in 1961. So we are in our 60th anniversary year at the McAllister House Museum in this year in 1921. Next slide, please. So bringing us up all the way to contemporary history that is being recovered and understood here on the McAllister House grounds, I wanted to show you some things that we have found very recently. During COVID and that time that we were closed, we did some research on the grounds of the McAllister House. And one of the fantastic things that was found was this silver spoon. And let me explain a little bit about what we're looking at here. And I think everyone will be very, very happy to see what this is about. The maker's mark is from L. Latimus. Louis Latimus worked in Philadelphia during mid-century. The particular maker's mark on this spoon indicates that this is a pre-1853 spoon, that this was manufactured before 1853. The engraving up on the handle says EC. That's what's on there. Well, that's Elizabeth Cooper. Her maiden name is Cooper, and that's Mrs. McAllister, the major's wife. She was born in 1836. So if we look at the maker's mark of being pre-1853 and when Elizabeth Cooper was born, we can look at the spoon and think that it possibly was part of a hope chest of Mrs. McAllister's that then would have been brought out when they moved to Colorado Springs, and at some point it was lost on the grounds of the McAllister House and now has been recovered. We were just ecstatic to find this. We're very happy to know more about Mrs. McAllister, and anything that we can find out about her, we're pleased to incorporate into our interpretation. So this was a great discovery. Down at the bottom there, in between the two more bold statements is Latimus, Lewis and Company, 802 Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. Chestnut Street is the Broadway or the Tejon Street of Philadelphia, the commercial district. And so he was in business for some time there in Philadelphia and a well-known silversmith. Next slide, please. These are a few other objects that have been found recently on the grounds. Up on the upper left here, we have something that it could have been worn as a brooch, but most likely would have been called a lingerie pin. And that was to keep your lingerie and your outer garments in sync so that your lingerie would never be exposed to the public, keeping them together and keeping them from moving around. On the bottom left, we have some of those famous 44 Henry cartridges, rimfire, that have been found on the grounds. So that's always kind of interesting to remember the Old West on the grounds of the McAllister House. And then we've got a number of different objects here on the right, including a very heavy duty button, a hem weight, another one of the cartridges, and then a font that is T. We don't know what the association of that font might be with the McAllisters. We do know that the major worked as editor of the Out West newspaper for a short period of time, but why some font like that would be on the grounds of the McAllister House, we do not know. But we do know from finding these objects that if we decided to do some archaeological excavation on the grounds, that we probably would be able to find out a lot about the history of the grounds themselves, and most likely we would be able to find many cultural objects that would help us understand both the McAllisters and the city of Colorado Springs. That would be very interesting and I think fascinating for the community to understand. So that's something for us to look forward to in the future at the McAllister House Museum. And we were just very happy to show these to you folks and have the opportunity here in Colorado Springs 150th anniversary and the opportunity that PPLD has given us to talk to you today. Thank you. That's my presentation, Brett.
Thank you, Eric. I think that we'll definitely get some questions and get a little bit of discussion, especially about that archaeological discoveries you guys have made. Those look fascinating. Our next presenter is Gregory James Atkins. He's originally from Oklahoma. Greg earned a bachelor's degree in history from Oklahoma Panhandle State University, a master's degree in history from Oklahoma State University, and a PhD in history from Washington State University in 2019. From 2008 to 2012, he lived in Colorado Springs and worked as a high school teacher and adjunct history instructor. He is currently assistant director of FHS online at Fort Hays State University in Hays, Kansas. Greg is working on a book about how Colorado Springs carved out a national reputation over the last 150 years. Greg is also a previous regional history symposium speaker, and the title of his presentation is City Business, Colorado Springs and the Libertarian Party.
Thank you, Brett. And I want to thank Leah and Eric as well. Very interesting. I'm going to try to incorporate some of those points into my my presentation here. I want to thank Pikes Peak Library District, its sponsors and partners. And I think we're all honored to have Chris Nichols in the audience out there. I think it was 8 or 9 years ago when I first started researching Colorado Springs that Chris was showing me around the archives there at Pikes Peak Library District. So it's great to be back here for the 150th anniversary symposium. So this is a picture of City Hall in 1925, around 1925. Debates in the 1920s over how the city government of Colorado Springs conducted its business sparked a grassroots movement. That movement honed messages, it organized tactics, it built allies over the next 50 years. And I argue that this history is crucial for understanding the formation of the Libertarian Party of the United States, the nation's third largest political party today. I'll start at the formation of the Libertarian Party in 1971, then explore taxes and corporations in US history, and then jump to debates over city government in the Springs during the 1920s. And then from there, we'll move forward to see the 1970s once again in light of that half century of local history that preceded it. Just very quickly, in full disclosure, I'm not a libertarian, although I have several friends and family who are. Needless to say, my holiday gatherings are much like the debates over city business in Colorado Springs, full of meaning and often tense arguments. Next slide. So over the summer of 1971, the actions of the federal government, both overseas and at home, increasingly frustrated many Americans. Internationally, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the Nixon administration had secretly expanded the war in Vietnam. Domestically, unemployment and inflation were higher than they'd been for almost 20 years. In August 1971, the Nixon administration responded to the domestic situation by setting several wage and price controls and unmooring the US dollar from the gold standards set during the Second World War. These moves infuriated fiscal conservatives and anti-tax activists around the country, but especially the growing anti-New Deal faction of the Republican Party that drew much of its strength from voters in the US West. That faction had grown powerful enough to rival the more moderate East Coast Republican establishment by 1971. In fact, the Western faction had backed one of their own, Barry Goldwater, as a presidential candidate in 1964. And in part, Nixon won the presidency in 1968 by wooing this Western faction. Nixon's policies in 1971, however, angered many of these libertarian Western conservatives who felt that Nixon and the entire Republican Party had betrayed them. A man in Westminster, Colorado, named David Nolan and a few friends considered starting a new national party. It was only after 3 activists from Colorado Springs joined them that the group started the Libertarian Party of the United States. The new party officially started in the living room of Luke Zale, one of the newest members from the Springs. Zale became the party's first life member. Luke Zale was the president of the El Paso County Taxpayers Association, a group that shaped debates over city business for 50 years by protesting local taxes and what they called local government overreach. Zell and the other Colorado Springs activists offered the fledgling Libertarian Party decades of experience with organizing, networking, and structuring an organization. Before 1971, free market and libertarian-leaning advocates believed a national party would suppress the very individualism and free expression they so cherished as libertarians. Zale, his friends, and the decades of success in Colorado Springs that they represented helped Nolan and others overcome this hurdle of worrying about establishing a party. After offering some deep historical context, we will explore the El Paso County Taxpayers Association and the growing network of libertarian-minded organizations in Colorado Springs. Next slide. Americans hate taxes, period. Famously, taxation without representation was one of the mantras that rallied colonists against Britain. Not surprisingly, once the nation was formed, hatred of taxes helped fuel rebellions against it. Just a few well-known early examples were Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s, the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s, and the nullification crisis of the 1830s. Most tax revolts failed chiefly because of the disorder and the loose affiliation among anti-tax agitators. Although one or a handful of influential people often championed these movements, these leaders usually lacked a broad common cause beyond just hatred of taxes. In the 19th century, though, a new form of organizing held far more efficient possibilities. The scale of the railroads that brought US citizens to the West is almost beyond comprehension even today. These railroads affected millions of people. The rails relied on a massive global immigration system for their construction and displaced millions of native peoples and citizens of other countries. A powerful new form of corporate organization made all of that possible. In the mid-1800s, Congress empowered transcontinental railroad companies to operate in states where the corporations had no headquarters and to raise capital through stocks. In doing so, Congress extended some of the nation's sovereignty over interstate commerce so companies could operate in places without a headquarters, and some of the nation's sovereign power over the money supply for the raising of capital through stocks. Colorado Springs, Denver, and thousands of other municipalities in the US owe their existence to the railroads. Throughout the US, corporations and nonprofits organized using that same modern corporate model. This gave freedom of association, especially among white colonizers in the US West, a very strong organizing principle. In Colorado Springs, for instance, the Colorado Springs Company used this power to carefully organize the town. So efficiency was an essential pillar of the town from the beginning, and an ideal place for anti-tax advocates who look to use the corporate model to organize themselves as nonprofit corporations and further push efficiency. Next slide. At the early 20th century, even many critics of big business, such as progressives, lauded the purity and efficiency of the corporate model for government. A wide consensus formed around the idea of making city governments mirror that model. In the 19-teens and 1920s, many municipalities adopted what was called the city manager form of government. Like corporations, the city manager form of government sought to separate city councils, or board of directors, from a professional chief executive tasked with running the organization, or mayor. Many cities, including Colorado Springs, felt the city manager form would accomplish two goals: eliminate corrupt city political machines that use appointed positions to pay for votes, and to encourage a business level of efficiency. And with Colorado Springs' almost obsessive quest for business efficiency in politics and society, the city became an ideal place for those who believed the quest could always go further to become more efficient. Next slide. The campaign of the Colorado Springs Taxpayer Association to lower taxes, read the Gazette on March 5th, 1920, is on. The Colorado Springs Taxpayers Association was the forerunner of the El Paso County Taxpayers Association. The association first formed in 1920 to stop a street pavement project, drastically reduce the city's tax revenue, and require the city to never use bonds for any future improvement, but always pay cash. Only in Colorado Springs could an organization with eventual nationwide significance get its start by objecting to the condition of the city's roads. A city government, like a large corporation, has got to adjust itself to conditions which arise, stated the association's lawyer Samuel Kinsey. We have no desire to punish the city officials, he continued, but we believe the city has made some errors and seek to correct them. The association was popular enough to gather signatures from at least 10% of citizens in the improvement district, which demanded the project be put to a special vote in September 1920. In a city so consumed by the redeeming quality of business efficiency, the council and chamber chose to respond using the association's own tactics. So instead of objecting to the association's arrogance at telling the council what to do, the council and chamber pointed out the city already had paid $11,000 on preparing the project, and this special vote would cost another $5,000. It is thought, reported the Gazette, that a number of the citizens prefer to wait until the city manager form of government has been installed before carrying out the pavement scheme. Voters approved the paving, but the association succeeded in slowing the project for months. Next slide. In 1931, the Colorado Springs Taxpayer Association had adopted the name El Paso County Taxpayers Association. Despite the adoption of the city manager form shortly after the paving in 1921, the association continued to believe Colorado Springs could run more efficiently. The Great Depression caused the group to become even more critical of government spending. In January 1931, the chair of the association's education committee, Francis Schreiber, met with District 11 School Board and the Chamber of Commerce. Schreiber was a local lawyer and Republican leader in the city. At the meeting, he asked District 11 to terminate 50 teaching positions and refund the entire $1.1 million bond measure for the junior high. Ruth Banning Lewis, who was president of the school board, refused, citing that the tenure of the teachers and the structure of the bonds made both demands legally impossible. With no success there, the association turned its attention just a couple of days later to city efforts to curtail unemployment. The unemployment problem in the city revealed that while the association agreed in principle with the city manager form, they often disagreed with the city managers themselves. On January 30th, 1931, the association met with the Organization of the Unemployed, a group claiming to represent 1,100 jobless in Colorado Springs. The meeting ended suddenly and in anger when someone in the association questioned whether unemployed workers wanted work or handouts. City manager Earl Mosley knew the association's position. Nevertheless, he had the Chamber of Commerce send letters to 64 lodges and organizations, including the El Paso County Taxpayers Association, which he pointed out in the article where he's talking about sending these letters, outlining the program for unemployed relief and asking for active cooperation. So Mosley chose to call out the association by name in a Gazette article. 2 weeks later, kind of in response to this, Merrill Shroop, another city lawyer and Republican leader, became the association president. Shroop was the son of former Colorado Governor Oliver Shroop, a Republican. These new leaders did not aim at single initiatives. They aimed at changing the city government all over again. With the help of former Governor Shroop, the association wanted a smaller council with the possibility of completely overturning the entire council every 4 years. Furthermore, the association attacked Mayor George Birdsell in a Gazette advertisement entitled "A Tax-Free City or a Saturnalia of Waste." Again, the association tasted defeat, the amended charter failed, and Birdsell remained mayor throughout the 1930s. Next slide. The Great Depression and Second World War, however, dramatically changed perceptions of the Republican Party, the city manager, and the leadership and institutions of Colorado Springs. On May 23rd, 1937, the Gazette, a newspaper aligned with the Republican Party since 1872, announced it had broken away from that party. The article cited support of the New Deal by many Republicans as a reason for that break. The paper also objected to the party's lackluster response to stop President Roosevelt from adding justices to the Supreme Court. "How is this crisis to be met?" asked the Gazette editorial board. "We believe by complete political reorganization." The Gazette found that new political direction on January 11th, 1946, when the company's president announced the sale of the newspaper to the voluntarist and libertarian-leaning Hoyles family. Harry Hoyles, son of newspaper tycoon Raymond Hoyles, became publisher of the Gazette and Telegraph. Shortly thereafter, about a year, in October 47, Earl Mosley, who was the city manager for 16 years, even after calling the association out over the unemployment initiative, asked the council for a 5 mil increase in the property tax levy. Doubting Mosley's efficiency, Mayor James McCullough went around Mosley's authority to directly take reports from city departments. Mosley resigned from the city manager position in protest, ending his 17-year service in the position. The city manager position was a revolving door for the next decade. Meanwhile, the association and the libertarian leaders of the Gazette Telegraph were making more allies. In '54, the Hoyles family hired Robert Lefevre, a free market thinker and publisher who had worked for the libertarian-leaning Merwin K. Hart's National Economic Council in New York. Lefevre became an editorial writer for the Gazette Telegraph. In '56, he began construction of the Freedom School at a former campsite near Larkspur, Colorado. The Freedom School dedicated itself to teaching free market and libertarian principles. In the '50s, Hoyles, Merrill Shroop, Robert Lefevre worked together on different anti-tax initiatives while working at and serving on the board of the El Paso County Taxpayer Association, Freedom School, and newspapers. So you can see how those all became very allied. Next slide. The big annual Chamber of Commerce meeting at the Broadmoor in November 1961 signaled how mainstream libertarian ideals had become. The Chamber chose a dynamic speaker who revealed how these ideas could unite devoted libertarians like Hoyles and Lefebvre with Western conservative Republicans like Merrill and Oliver Shoup, and even Republicans more generally. And that speaker was Ronald Reagan. Reagan wanted more than finding ways for Colorado Springs local government to be more efficient. His speech used government efficiency to attack the federal government itself. For Reagan, only a conservative activism based on self-reliance, free enterprise, and the freedom of association could restore long-held ideals in individual freedom. Our free economy is the basis of our strength, and the security of the entire free world depends on the fiscal stability of the United States, Reagan claimed in a quote he attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Self-reliant citizens could seek welfare from the free economy of private businesses and religious organizations, he maintained, instead of relying on the government. Reagan closed his speech with a dire portent. "We must save freedom now," he warned, "or spend our sunset years telling our children what it was like when men were free." By 1961, the El Paso County Taxpayers Association slowly built alliances among the city's libertarian-leaning groups for decades. Reagan's oratory commenced a decade of further alliance building that ultimately culminated in the establishment of the Libertarian Party in Luke Zale's living room. Robert Lefebvre transformed Freedom School into an unaccredited 4-year libertarian college called Rampart College. In March 1963, he used his connections at the newspaper and chamber to advertise that transformation with a front-page Gazette Telegraph article that read, "Chamber Executive Committee welcomes Rampart College." The Rampart College pamphlet from 1967 revealed just how connected libertarian-friendly organizations in the region had become. Lefebvre's 2-week intensive executive courses were attracting a steady stream of corporate leaders and their spouses. The pamphlet listed the 2 saints of libertarian economics, the Austrian economists Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, as academic advisors to the college. Furthermore, Roger Millikan, Harry Hoyles, and Charles Koch were listed as trustees. A Gazette article from August 1967 showed that Charles R. Schley Jr., the former president and chief administrative officer of the powerful business group, the National Association of Manufacturers, had become the newest trustee to join Rampart College. Next slide. So by the end of the 1960s, the network of libertarians began to make further inroads with the city government and other local groups. In March 1969, the city council wanted to open a center for teenagers in downtown Colorado Springs to deal with racial problems and bridge the generation gap. Essentially try to be the Mama Susie to this new generation. And they were trying to use those principles that Reagan laid out to do that. The council fully understood that the cost of the center quickly would lead to accusations of waste, bloat, and bureaucracy. To avoid this, the council brought the El Paso County Taxpayers Association and an evangelical nonprofit called Young Life into the deal. The council proposed to pay the $2,500 a month rent on the massive building if Association President Luke Zale could get the libertarian business owners of the association to pay for the utilities, the upkeep, maintenance, and the salary for the staff. Meanwhile, Young Life promised to supply the staff itself. The conservative activism Reagan voiced years earlier helped bring evangelicals, libertarians, and the city's conservative politicians together on the Youth Center project. It was a chance to demonstrate the superiority of freedom of association, free enterprise, and self-reliance over government intervention. These values, conservative activists hope to show, not only could bring about economic prosperity, but fix its failings and provide the answers to the youth protests, the civil rights marches, and the unrest sweeping the nation. The center reflected the unifying faith at the core of Reagan's conservative activism. Organizations and corporations better organize society than federal regulation of welfare. Ideally, this faith made the government unnecessary. Functionally, however, it helped organizations and corporations control expensive infrastructure funded by taxes. The center's mix of faith, business, and politics presaged a neoliberalism that later swept the country in the 1980s and 90s. The story of Colorado Springs' contribution to libertarianism is relatively unknown still. Those who do know these stories, and a lot of them are on the Pikes Peak staff, they point to the buyout in 1946 of the Gazette Telegraph, by the Hoyles family, or the establishment of Rampart College by Robert Lefevre in 1963. These outside libertarian groups, however, did not arbitrarily choose to grow or locate in Colorado Springs simply because it was beautiful and relatively cheap. The long-running El Paso County Taxpayers Association has strong connections to both and offered them financial support and connections to local leaders, some with strong libertarian leanings themselves. The history of the El Paso County Taxpayer Association shows that libertarianism was not simply exotic in Colorado Springs or a migrant to Colorado Springs. It was a native. The El Paso County Taxpayers Association had shown through its extensive interaction with city business, its growing network of other libertarian leaning groups, and the growing national appeal of their message, that conditions were ripe for a national libertarian third party. How fitting it began in the living room of Association President Luke Zale. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was eye-opening for me, at least, as a newcomer. I think that the portion there that I definitely need to check out on the recording is the connection there with Young Life, evangelicalism, as well as the taxpayer revolt there. So I think I'm definitely going back to that. But I want to, at this point, open up the floor to all of our presenters, and we'll look through some of the questions that we've received and take a look and get some of this discussion going. So at this point, I think the first question that we actually got was for Leah, and that was, did Mama Susie have any contact, or did she help Dr. Isaac Edward Moore with his desire for a sanatorium for TB patients? Oh, Leah, I think you're still on mute.
Such a 2020, 2021 thing. Thank you, Brett. Thanks so much for that question. I really appreciate it. There wasn't any crossover, unfortunately, because Dr. Isaac Moore died in 1931 in a Fitzsimmons Army hospital. He was a World War I vet that had been gassed, suffered from tuberculosis himself. He did start a sanitarium here in Colorado Springs. He was, for quite a few years, the only African-American physician in Colorado Springs. After his death, his family, his son and wife moved, his children and wife moved to Southern California. But with Mama Susie Perkins arriving in 1937, there wasn't a crossover. And however, there's still so much more to learn about her. She has sort of come to light in recent years, and we are still gathering evidence. This is all research in progress. So if anyone out there has more information about her, please contact me. I'd love to know more. Thank you.
Perfect. And we're going to follow that one up with a question for Eric. Why do you think that the main thing that we remember about McAllister is his home instead of the rest of his contributions?
Thank you, Brett, and thank you for the question. It's a difficult question to answer because the answer is long and comprehensive, but the short answer is that probably McAllister would have wanted it that way. He was a modest individual. He had a Quaker background, and that also, I want to make sure that I talk about that reflected his family existence. So we want to include Mrs. McAllister and her family culture as a believing Quaker, a firm Quaker, in that modesty is the term that we use revolving around the McAllister house. There's a famous picture that we have early on, 1874, of the McAllister house, and this kind of explains that concept. The family has put themselves in the background of that image in front of the house, not out in front of the image where your faces would have been seen, or the health and well-being of your children that are in the arms of Mrs. and Mr. McAllister, but they're in the background right in front of the house. So it's the house that is important to the McAllisters, and that also kind of leads us to Quakerism, because Quakers typically do not go to church, they meet in houses. And so that house, the McAllister house, would have been the center of their universe. And that's kind of the shorter answer to that question.
Fantastic. I think we've got a couple follow-ups about the archaeology at the McAllister house. First question was, Could the McAllister House engage the city archaeologist to investigate the grounds?
Absolutely a possibility. We haven't developed plans for that interpretive aspect yet, but we would love to engage with the city, of course, for that. Whether that's actually the contractual obligation lies with the city or with a private contractor, we're not sure. And we have done, I think what the second part of the question is those things have been found through metal detection, through systematic metal detection. I've got a background in archaeology, and so we've been relatively systematic in doing some preliminary exploration of the grounds. And that's what we would do if we started a more serious investigation, is we would use probably something like ground penetrating radar to understand where we want to put in test pits and do some archaeology and get some rudimentary data first before we went and did a lot of digging.
That was absolutely the question that I sort of had too, was during the time during shutdown and COVID, were you guys out there with like doing the digs and everything? But it sounds like you guys were doing the exploratory phase prior to initiating something large scale like that. I'm going to follow that up with another question for Eric, and that's, I'd always heard that Stratton was the carpenter on the McAllister House. What evidence have you actually found to verify that?
Oh, that's a good question. Certainly anecdotal, a lot of anecdotal evidence. The family and the earlier interpretations of the museum have always pointed towards that. And I'm going to have to follow up on that, to be perfectly honest with you, and go back, and maybe that'll be my next project, to interpret Stratton a little bit more. We have been doing some construction work on the house through a grant right now, and that would be a good place to start, is to look at continuity of the construction. Certainly there have been updates, and so not all of the woodwork is Stratton's woodwork, but his style had been talked about, notches and knobs on the interior of the house for a long period of time. So mostly anecdotal at this point, but I am going to, you better believe it, follow up on that one, and please stop by and ask me that question again, and hopefully I'll have a good answer for you.
Eric, I just want to really quickly invite you to the archives of the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, as we have Stratton's personal papers. Would be a great place to find that answer.
Thank you, Leah.
The next question that we have, and I think this one's for Greg, was there any connection between the libertarian groups and the KKK?
That is a really interesting question. And one of the things that is happening in the 1920s that I find fascinating is Colorado as a whole state is being taken over at local levels, even the state level, with KKK affiliated candidates for government. One of the holdouts from that is Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs never does that, and it has this longer history that Leah kind of touches on of a very strong Black community that was fighting against it. I remember seeing articles where the Black community was protesting the showing of Birth of a Nation in Colorado Springs, succeeded, I think, in keeping it from being aired for at least a couple days. Eventually it is, but there is that much longer kind of very strong history in Colorado Springs. But I never saw any crossover between these libertarian leaders in the Taxpayer Association, at least, and the KKK. I will say that a lot of the literature that I see, like Merwin Hart, for instance, he's very anti-Semitic, but I never saw anything else besides the anti-Semitism in some of that literature. But that's a great question. I haven't done an extensive look in the 1920s and 30s at KKK affiliation and libertarian leaders.
I think there was another question really quickly, and that was Elizabeth Cooper McAllister a member of the local WCTU and or the women's suffrage movement in Colorado? I think, Eric, I was about to say, I think that one's for you, Eric.
Sounds like it. We do not have any evidence of her participating in the public to that extent. It appears that she preferred to be in the background and that her husband would be the voice of the family, from what we can tell. And if I could take the opportunity, I did just think of a little bit better answer than my last one based about the Winfield Scott Stratton, and that is primary evidence. So McAllister himself writes of his relationship with Stratton at an early period and conversations that he had regarding building the house. So while I don't have specific evidence of Stratton saying I did this particular aspect or that particular aspect, we have pretty firm evidence that he had contracted on the McAllister House.
Okay, I think we've just about hit most of the questions here, but I did want to throw it out to Greg and Leah. Were there any other things that you guys wanted to hit on that weren't necessarily noted in the chat or the questions?
I'll say one thing, and basically it's a answer to your query at the very end of my lecture presentation. The reference to City Hall, Young Life, and the Libertarian El Paso County Taxpayer Association, I could send you the newspaper articles. Rocky Mountain News actually picked it up. And Luke Zale has a very long quote. The mayor has a very long quote. It's a really interesting article. So.
And
Perfect.
I would just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Leah.
I would just like to add that I really appreciate altogether our conversation this morning about our local history. We're never done learning about our local history, our regional history, and its impact and connection to national and international narratives and vice versa. There's so much more to learn. There's so many more individuals and phenomena, dynamics, processes. We don't always have to talk about the same people over and over again. I really enjoyed listening to both Eric and Greg today, learning new aspects about our history, and I look forward to continued conversations. There are many, many absences in our local story, and it's our work to fill those absences. So thank you to the co-panelists, and also thank you to PPLD. This has been wonderful.
I think we've actually got two more questions after I threw it out to you guys for some closing comments. So these ones looks like for Greg. Is there a connection between the creation of the Free Press newspaper and the Hoyley's political and economic philosophy?
Absolutely. And I actually had it in the presentation, and then I timed myself, and I felt like I was gonna eat into another 5 minutes. I just didn't want to spare, but once the Hoyles family takes over, there's a large union presence at the Gazette when they do buy it. Interestingly enough, I'll pause to say, he had several other newspapers. One of them was the Santa Ana Register in California that becomes a hub for libertarian and Western conservatives. That's actually a really important piece to a lot of scholarship on the rise of Western conservatism. Is the Santa Ana Register, and yet no one has really, at least nationally, looked at the Gazette as an important hub too. But once they buy it, the union, all those union journalists are let go, and they eventually form the Free Press. And one of the things I'll say really quickly is when Robert Lefevre goes to and uses his connections with the Gazette to get this front page story about the Chamber of Commerce welcoming Rampart College, the Free Press fire back 2 or 3 days later with another article that says, why are we giving press to a college that's not even in the city of Colorado Springs or El Paso County? And then cuts to the mayor saying, if you're going to give money to any college, why don't you give it to Colorado College, which has been here, is right in the city, and has a sterling reputation for years. So you can see the back and forth, especially over these libertarian ideas. When they hit the Gazette or the Free Press, there's certainly a slant on both.
And Greg, I think we've got another follow-up there. Is there a connection between the libertarian groups and Tabor?
Yes, I haven't looked into it a whole lot. I wanted to get up to 1971. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if it's Luke Zale, but there is one of these presidents for the El Paso County Taxpayer Association later on that, later side, more recent history that is really good friends with, and now I'm blanking on the architect of Tabor. Oh, such a colorful guy in the news all the time.
I'm completely blanking as well, so I do I try and throw you a lifeline.
I'm sorry, but they Doug Bruce. Thank you so much. And they were close friends. But one of the things that's a difficulty for the Libertarian Party, and it was even at its inception, is how incredibly different libertarians are. Right? I mean, all the way from being very socially liberal and fiscally conservative to people that are more about the fiscal conservatism and not so much about the social liberalism. So Doug Bruce and this president of the El Paso County Taxpayer Association were friends, but had their tensions, and he never had joined the El Paso County Taxpayer Association as far as I know. So there was that tension of, that freedom of association, but there is connection there. There's definitely cross-fertilization of ideas.
One thing that I also say, and this is what is, and I think Leah sort of mentioned this a moment ago, when we're in person, these are the conversations that we can open up the floor to so that more folks can join in there. I'm gonna throw the plug out to that September in-person mini symposium. We can continue some of these conversations and make them a little bit more organic with everyone. I think that's what we miss when we do the virtual, is that everybody's that's in chat throwing out names. That's what we need. So definitely, please, if you have the time free on your calendar for September, please throw us in here and try and make that connection. The date was, I want to say, the 25th. It's over here somewhere. Yep, September 25th, 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Mini catch up. But I definitely a thing that I think that as engaged citizens, we can really start to think about how we got to today, looking at the history as Greg has presented, Eric has presented, and Leah. So these conversations are the kinds of things that the symposium really sort of tees us up for as the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to be thinking about all these presentations. Eric, I had given everybody else an opportunity to sort of have some final words. Did you have any final words before we call it a day?
Thank you, Brett. I saw a question in there that I just wanted to address because it's a significant question, and that is, why didn't I mention about McAllister being an attorney? And that is because Major McAllister was not an attorney. He never studied law except for informally. His son, who we call Harry McAllister, and they always called Harry McAllister, became a very powerful Colorado lawyer, transportation. One of his big contracts was the Denver and Rio Grande, but the Major was not a practicing attorney ever. Thank you.
Cool. Well, the two things that I'll remind everybody is we have another session in August, another symposium session, and the speakers are Rick Sturdivant, Mark James, and Kathy Sturdivant. And then once again, we will have an in-person social on September 25th. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much for all of our speakers, and thank you all for participating today. As participants, you could have been anywhere today, doing anything, listening to any speaker, and you chose us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.